Braves Country today. We're talking Southern sports. We go live 3 to 5 weekdays right here on WQEE. Braves Country today, Southern sports talk with the voice of Braves Country baseball, Mac McGee. Joined every day from sports analysts from all over Braves Country, talking college football, the NFL, Major League Baseball, and what's trending in the world of sports. Braves Country today. We go live 3 to 5 weekdays right here on WQEE.
Armchair.
There's something kind of about a kid that's never played baseball.
We have been hoodwinked, bamboozled, and flat out deceived.
Why did you get so drunk?
You got drunk. I'm just really exhausted.
What's in that cup?
Armor Cokes.
Do you have any idea how important this is? We're trying to save the pub cup. Really? This is what you're doing? This is what you're doing?
Chief, what do you want to do tonight?
The same thing we do every night. Try to take over the world.
106 miles to Chicago. We got a full tank of gas, half a pack of cigarettes. It's dark, and we're wearing sunglasses. Hit it.
Armchair.
YouTube Live.
Radio station.
The radio station you can call your own. Do you know what listeners like about our station?
I like everything. It's always on my radio.
We never stop the music, except for now, when I talk.
You're in Braves Country.
Welcome in, Braves Country. Let's do this one right. We are talking about the great Boston Braves. In Boston, I figured this would be a good time to hit the Once Upon a Pastime series with your Atlanta Braves organization. And I know most people know that the Braves started in Boston, but they probably don't know a lot about them. And so we're going to kind of go over that today and really dive into who the Braves are, who the Braves were, because this team is the oldest continuous franchise in Major League Baseball, right? And the Boston Braves originated in Boston, Massachusetts, obviously, and they played in Boston from 1871 to 1952. So, good 80 years in Boston. They did win one World Series. We'll get into that. But one of the things that's overlooked with the Boston Braves, the Atlanta Braves, because when a team moves, I think it gets lost in translation as far as what a franchise has done, because I think a lot of fans want to separate, and you really shouldn't. If the New York Yankees tomorrow got up and moved and went to wherever, whether they kept the Yankees name or not, there'd still be a heck of a history with that organization. And the Atlanta Braves, the Boston Braves, the Milwaukee Braves, the Boston Redstockings, who we began with, the Boston Redcaps, Beaneaters, Doves, Rustlers, Bees. It's all the same franchise. And whether folks know it or not, or have paid enough attention or not, I think it's coming more to light as we get more into the information age where so much of this stuff is at your fingertips, but who has time to really go into it, right? Who has time to read up? Well, I do a lot of it. I read a lot of not just Braves history, but baseball history in general, and really have never done one of these. And I wanted to commit a solid episode to the Braves organization. They started in 1871, and they won their first pennant in 1872. So this is a rich and storied franchise. They have won 22 pennants. We have won 16 world titles. 16 world titles. Even though we're normally just credited with the 4 World Series, there was a lot of baseball played before 1903 when the World Series first came into play. And I don't think that you can take away from the fact that a team has won championships just because they came up with a new way of looking at it. I'll give you an example. You ask a Green Bay Packer fan how many championships they won. They don't just point to, there's a reason why they call themselves Titletown, right? They don't just point to the World Series history. They point to all of their championships, and rightfully so. If you ask a Green Bay Packer how many championships they've had, they'll tell you they've had 13 league championships. And that's what I'm telling you about the Atlanta Braves. Atlanta Braves have had 16. 4 in the World Series era, 12 prior to. We got the first championship in 1872. And when you look at the Boston Braves and what they were doing, 82 years in Massachusetts, the franchise was known by different names. They started off as the Redstockings, right? From 1871 to 1875, we were the Boston Redstockings. And the team, while in Boston, won 10 National League pennants and a World Series in 1914. But before the National League, it was the National Association. It was technically called the National Association of Professional Baseball Players, NAPBP. But most, when you see it shortened in most articles or whatnot, they just call it the NA, which is a little confusing because you normally see the NA on a lot of things that's not available. But the National Association, the original Boston Red Stockings teams, that's what makes them the oldest continuous playing team in American professional sports. There was no football. There was no basketball. There's no hockey. There's no pickleball. So in 1871, they became the Boston Red Stockings, and the history begins. The only other team that has been organized for as long was the Cubs, but they did not play for 2 years following the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. So that's where it gets a little tricky. But the Braves started playing in 1871, and they had a fire in the grandstands, but they did continue to play. The Great Chicago Fire is a totally different story. We don't have time to get into all that today, but if you know the Great Chicago Fire story, you'll understand why they did not play baseball for 2 years in Chicago. So here we go. The early history of the team, they were originally called the Cincinnati Redstockings, established in 1869, voted to dissolve after 1870. Player manager Harry Wright went to Boston, Massachusetts at the invitation of the newly founded Boston Red Stockings. So it gets a little confusing because Harry Wright, who is one of the grandfathers of baseball, played for both the Chicago Red Stockings, who had this enormous, and we are planning on doing a Once Upon a Pastime on the Cincinnati Red Stockings. But they had an enormous following because they had this huge winning streak that ended up dying. I want to say 131. It was somewhere in that neighborhood. And when that fell off, the fandom fell off for the Red Stockings. Because what they were is that they were a barnstorming tour. They called Cincinnati their home and played most of their games in Cincinnati. But when they finally lost a game in what was something newly tried out called extra innings, Harry Wright and company opted to try to win the game in extra innings. They lost. It ended their 100. I want to say 131, but I could have that number wrong. It was somewhere in that neighborhood. They ended up dissolving the team because fans quit coming to the stands because it was no longer the cool hip thing. It's almost the equivalent, although they weren't rigged games and they weren't showboating. It was a different type of thing, but it would be the equivalent of what the hell the Harlem Globetrotters just lost, right? Say they lost their fandom and they dissolved the team, and Harry Wright with brother George Wright and a couple other Cincinnati players joined the Boston Red Stockings. Boston Red Stockings founder Ivers Whitney Adams was the original owner of the Boston Red Stockings, and he helped put together the National Association. And he was a businessman in Ashburnham, Massachusetts. Left the town of 19 to seek fortune and fame in Boston, and away we go. And he was the president of something called the American Net Twine Company, and made a lot of money and decided that he wanted to get into the game of baseball, open up the Red Sox, or the Red Stockings, and brought Harry Wright and his brother over to Boston. What you have to realize is that they had a name already established. It was Harry Wright, and George Wright was his brother. You go to the Hall of Fame, you'll see them splattered all over the place. The original Boston Red Stockings team starts playing 1871 and 1872. They win their first pennant. Back then, you didn't have a World Series, you didn't have a championship series. You played your season. It was much like the way professional soccer is over in Europe. You played your season, and whoever had the most wins was the champion. They did, at the time, it was looked upon as you wouldn't dream of watering down the season that you had of all the games you played and won for a series. That changed in 1903 when the Boston Pilgrims, which are the Red Sox, it's not the Braves organization, when Boston played Pittsburgh and they saw what the gate receipts were. They're like, holy cow, we've got something here. But as time goes along, a lot of these guys that make these decisions aren't always right, and they didn't realize what they would have had. Now, what you see on the screen for the Boston Braves is that is the old South End's ground. And that is the original stadium for the Boston Braves. And so they played there at the very beginning in 1871 and were there for quite some time until they moved to Braves Field. We'll get into that in a minute. But this is what they played in. They had the grandstands behind home plate and the fans would spray out down the right and left field line. Typically back in those days, and this was very, very common, is that you did not have an outfield backing you up. It's one of the reasons why home runs were not as common as they are today. There's a lot of reasons, but that's one of the reasons, is because you would go just as far back as you could to go get the ball. And if you could get the ball back in, these guys were athletic. They may not have had the hose that, when you think of someone gunning it from right field nowadays, they may not have had that kind of cannon, but they had an arm. They were very good in fundamentals back then. And with the fundamentals, you're talking about hitting the cutoff man, et cetera, et cetera. So home runs were pretty rare back in that day because of the simple fact that you just did not have that kind of situation going on where the ball would just roll and roll and roll and no one went and got it. It didn't die in the stands. You kept going. Now, what would change down the road is that you would start having fans in the grandstands, right? And you would have the fans the fans trickling back in the back. I said grandstands, but I meant back in the back of the outfield seats that we look at today. The bleachers is what we would call it today. Back then they didn't have any bleachers, but they would start roping it off back there, have fans back there charging admission because they got tired of people watching for free. And so that's where that's at. And with that being said, home runs became a little more prevalent. Home runs really hit the big time. You'll notice in the 1920s, and the reason why that was is because stadiums like Yankee Stadium were built, and once the ball went so far, it was a home run. It was no longer run and go get it. There are many stories that talk about that when they started roping off that back area and they would drive people in, that if you're playing at home and the ball was hit far, the patrons would bend that rope towards the field so that they could come up, not only just get the souvenir, but also to help their team win, right? So all this is in play when you talk about the early history of Major League Baseball. But as far as the Boston Braves are concerned, and of course, conversely, if the ball was hit and you were the home team and you were in the field of play, you'd pull the rope back to give your man a chance to make the catch. And then the gambling got involved in the late 1890s, and the gamblers are out there in the bleachers, so to speak. And they would be out there affecting the rope going back and forth and the crowd going back and forth. They'd also be out there trying to pay off the guy, say, hey, drop that ball, I'll give you 20 spot. Some other guy is out there yelling, catch the ball, I'll give you 25. So it was a different game, a different era back then. These guys weren't making a lot of money, so some guys could be had. And you can scoff at it now, but you weren't out there playing back in those days, and you don't know what you would do. You think you know, but you don't know. So the Braves come in, and they start play. And not only do they win the pennant in the NA pennant, the National Association pennant, National League will come into existence in 1876. But from 1871 to 1875, the Atlanta Braves won. The Atlanta Braves organization. Boston Redstockings won. 72, 73, 74, and 75. 4-time winners of the NA. Four times winners, and there was only 5 seasons. 1876, the National League is formed. It's a compilation of some of the teams that are in the NA and some expansion teams, and they brought some ones from over. But the Boston Red Caps, as they were called at that point, so they're the Redstockings from 1871 to 1875. But because there were so many teams, including the Cincinnati Redlegs, later on you had the Boston Red Sox, so many teams were naming their teams after their attire. That's where the White Sox come from. There were the Blue Sox. There were a lot of teams. So they decided to set themselves apart and became the Boston Red Caps. They went out and got a bunch of red caps and became known as the Boston Red Caps. Still keeping with the red theme. In 1876, the National League is formed. They join it, and their first National League pennant is a year later in 1877. This Boston Braves team would dominate the early part of the National League. And we're going to take a really quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the beginning of the Braves franchise in the National League itself, leading up to their first World Series championship. We'll be back in a flash here on Braves Country.
Are you okay, pal?
I had a rough day on the job.
Bowling's insane! Bowling is crazy time! Bowling? I don't think so, George. You get no rush from bowling. Rush? You want to rush? Drop a ball on your toe, my friend. Talk about a rush. You'll be throbbing. You'll see vision.
At Jewelers Mutual, we're a little obsessed with jewelry. Obsessed like auctioneers with talking fast.
50, we're going to fit so.
Pop stars with auto-tune.
Yeah.
And dentists with asking questions.
So, how did he propose?
After they've put their hands in your mouth.
Great.
Yes, we've made jewelry our obsession for over 100 years. We love it so much, we named our kids Ruby, Amber, and Opal.
Venti soy latte for Opal?
At Jewelers Mutual, we insure jewelry and only jewelry, which is why people who are also obsessed with jewelry trust us with theirs.
Hey, Braves Country. Braves Country HD is bringing you Braves Country Baseball. Braves Country comes to you every Tuesday night and Friday night, and 2 bonus games every week. Hi, I'm Mac McGee, and we'll be bringing you play-by-play, pitch-by-pitch of your Atlanta Braves. It's free to listen. Please like and subscribe. YouTube.com/@Braves Country. Braves Country Baseball for the fans, by the fans.
The most popular and most notorious star of the 19th century was Michael Joseph King Kelly, the sure-handed catcher for the Chicago White Stockings. He was so skilled at stealing bases, he once stole 6 in a single game, that he inspired a popular song, Slide, Kelly, Slide. He sometimes cut across the diamond, skipping second altogether when the umpire was not looking. Kelly drank as hard as he competed. Once, A.G. Spaulding put Pinkerton detectives on his trail and accused him of having been in a saloon at 3 a.m. drinking lemonade. Kelly was indignant. It was straight whiskey, he said. I never drank a lemonade at that hour in my life.
as we are talking the Boston Braves, the Braves organization in Boston, however you want to word it, because they weren't the Boston Braves every time, as we've already kind of gone over. They had several names, and now they are the Boston Red Caps. It's 1876. They win their first championship in 1877, their first pennant in the National League. They already had 4 pennants prior to in the National Association. So pennant number 5 takes place in 1877. And when they join the National League, by the way, they win their very first game. Season back then, it started till late April. For good reason. Most of the games were being played in the Northeast. April 22nd, 1876, the Boston Red Caps defeat the Philadelphia Athletics and win 6-5, and the rest is history. So we win the pennant in 1877. We win it in 1878. And then there's a little bit of a lull. We don't win another pennant until 1883. Now, back then, the National League, along with the National Association, there weren't as many teams back then. So when you're like, how could you play whole season not have a championship series? It would feel cheap. Imagine if today we were playing, and at the end of the season, there was only 8 of us, 10 of us, but at one point, National League, 8 teams. Imagine playing all those games, and you don't have a tie to any other league, and you win. I'll give you an example. Let's take the American League, or excuse me, the National League East, the National League Central. Let's put them together. You still have 10, but still it's close enough. And the Braves are running away with it right now if you put the records together today. And let's just say, for argument's sake, they're sitting out there, the 10, 12 game lead. They win the division. They win the league by double digits. It would feel cheap to then just grab the random second place team and say, we're going to play a series, and whoever wins that particular series, even though you won the league by 20 games, we're going to take that one series and say you're the champion. And that was their philosophy back then. You didn't have as many teams. Now that changes when the American League and National League, because the American League comes along about 10 to 15 years after what I'm referring to right now. They come along and they build their own league, and then there's a big argument which league is better, and that's kind of how that came about. It's much like the way, if you're a football fan, NFL, you had the AFC, or you had the AFL and the NFL, and when they merged, they turned into the NFC, AFC under the National Football League shield. Well, this was National League. Eventually, there's an American League. There was a Players League. There was a Federals League. There were a lot of leagues, but the one that made it was the American League, and so they put them together. And they didn't want to lose the league moniker. That was a National League thing. National League wanted to hold on to the history, the rich history. So that's how they came up with the term Major League Baseball. So they wanted to keep the American and the National separate. Of course, little did they know years from now there really would be no separation, because you've got nothing but every single day there's an interleague game. So all that rich history kind of died on the vine around 20 years ago. But here we are, and we hit the 1880s. We have 6 championships in our pocket. We win 1 pennant in 1883. So kind of a dry decade. And they then turn their attention to the 1890s, and they are back. And they are back in a big way. And during the 19th century, the Boston Red Caps, as they were called, along with the Beaneaters, they would win pennants So we already talked about the NA pennant. You had 4 in your pocket. You win 2 more, you got 6 going into the 1880s. You get a 7th in 1883. In 1891, 92, 1893, 1897, 1898, they would win 5 more pennants. And those 5 pennants, along with the pennants that were won in the NA and in the early stages of the NL, make the Braves organization. They were the New York Yankees before the New York Yankees existed. They were the most dominant team in all of baseball, winning all of those pennants. And when you're talking about sitting there with 12 pennants in your pocket before the 20th century hits, that's very impressive. They would hit, once you got into, by the way, the 1898 team, the won the pennant, finished 102 and 42nd, 102 and 47. A club record for winning percentage that would stand for almost a century. And they were known as the Heavenly Twins with Hugh Duffy and Tommy McCarthy. And a guy by the name of Sliding Billy Hamilton. I love that because I when I hear sliding, I hear the Braves. What's the first thing you think of is slid, right? So even back then, we were sliding and winning pennants. When the American League's new Boston entry was set up shop in 1901, the Beaneaters were decimated. At that point, they were called the Beaneaters. So let's backtrack real quick. They go from the Red Caps, 1876 to 1882. From 1883 until 1906, they are known as the Boston Beaneaters. One of my favorite names in the history of sport. I just think it's a great name. Would make no sense to call them that in Atlanta. But the Bean, literally because of the Boston Bean, they were known as the Beaneaters. Most of the fans back then would shorten it to the Beans, Boston Beans. And a lot of them would be shortening to that to call them the Bees, which is how they ended up. It's one of the reasons why they ended up with that nickname. From 36 to 1940, they were called the Boston Bees, and that had a lot to do with it. So here we are, beginning of the 20th century. The Boston Redstockings come along, and you got yourself a bit of a mess. First of all, the Redstockings quickly changed the name to the Red Sox after there was some confusion before they were the Pilgrims, right? But anyways, when the Boston team comes in, and they went through a handful of names, but when the Boston American League entry comes in and set up shop in 1901, That's why you see the big drop-off. So you're like, man, how did this team win, 5 pennants in the 1890s? And then there's this big gap from 1898 to 1914 before they win another pennant. It was because, of course, back then, there weren't the rules that are set up now, and they were bidding on them, especially because they were rival leagues until the marriage in the early part of the 19th century between the AL and the NL. So what you have there is they kind of had to start over from scratch. There were teams that were jumping ship. Michael King Kelly. All of the stars would jump ship, say, well, this guy's paying me a little more this week. I'm going over here. And that's the disaster that was. So they don't win another championship, but they have all of these pennants in their pocket. And they're flying around the stadium. And you're out there, and the Boston Braves are still a very popular team. And they then start looking at Boston Braves Field, which is opened up in 1915 after the Miracle Braves, because they were still pretty popular when they really hit their stride around the 1910s. The South End grounds just was not big enough. Now, they were in Fenway Park. From the South End grounds to the Congress Street grounds, I left a little bit of that out. I do apologize. In 1894, they went to the Congress Street grounds because of the fire that took place in the grandstands, and they had to have somewhere to play. But for all intents and purposes, for a little over 30 years, they were in the South End grounds until 1914. They did play in Fenway Park a little bit, but those weren't typically every single game. But the game of baseball is growing. No longer is it acceptable to have these stadiums set up where you don't have outfield, because if you don't have outfield stands, whether they're bleachers or however you have it set up, you're basically talking about a team that can't compete financially. Back then, there were no media right deals. So all your money you were making was literally from people watching the games. And that will take us up to where they become the Boston Braves, going to Braves Field. We will be back in a flash talking about the Boston Braves here on Braves Country today.
JD.
So's your face.
That doesn't even make any sense.
So's your face always makes sense.
JD, that's stupid.
So's your face. I'm on fire. Hello!
Here are some baseball facts that you might not have known. Bob Feller was one of the best and most feared pitchers of all time, especially because of his fastball. As a teenager, Feller was already a famous prospect. At the age of 16, a scout offered Feller a contract of $1 and an autographed baseball, which Feller accepted.
And there's a drive, deep right field, long gone for McCann.
Another big jack for BMAC. And ladies and gentlemen, the most exciting 2 minutes in all of sports.
Hey, Braves Country. Braves Country HD is bringing you Braves Country Baseball. Braves Country comes to you every Tuesday night and Friday night, and 2 bonus games every week. Hi, I'm Mac McGee, and we'll be bringing you play-by-play, pitch-by-pitch of your Atlanta Braves. It's free to listen. Please like and subscribe. YouTube.com/@Braves Country. Braves Country Baseball, for the fans, by the fans.
Walter Johnson's record of 110 shutouts still stands. He once held the New York Highlanders scoreless 3 times in 4 days. And although he rarely had the backing from the Senators that he deserved, he managed to win 417 games over his career, and to win 20 or more games for 10 successive seasons. The relentless velocity of his pitching won him the nickname Big Train.
Sometimes he's referred to as a legend. He isn't a legend. A legend, according to Webster, has yet to be proved. It's a bit mythical. There's nothing mythical about Walter Johnson. He existed and was probably the best pitcher of all time.
You're listening country. Wanted to touch on the Boston Braves with you today, where it all began. So where we left off was the team is having a hard time keeping up. They're getting poached from the Boston American League team that eventually becomes the Red Sox. They're getting poached by the American League, and they're trying to build back a winner. So one of the first media-driven nicknames in all of sports changes to the Boston Doves in 1907. And there was the Dove company that was sponsoring them. And then the funny story about this is, so you'll look at it and you're like, okay, the Boston Doves, we go from the Beaneaters end in 1906. The Boston Doves happens from 1907 to 1910. So then the money runs out and the sponsorship runs out, and they go to the Boston Rustlers, and that was literally because they didn't know what they were going to call the team, but they were doing it to change their luck. And they just thought, we'll go with the Boston Rustlers. It did nothing. Boston Rustlers were terrible. So the president of the club then decided to name the club after the owner, James Gaffney. James Gaffney was called one of the Braves of New York City's political machine. Tammany Hall, which used... So what they're doing is that they called him, if this makes sense, one of the Braves of New York City's political machine. John Ward, one of the grandfathers of baseball as well, decided it would be a good thing to call the new Boston, the new name for the Boston baseball team, the Braves. Their symbol that they used in New York, because the nickname of one of the Braves of the New York political machine, if this makes sense, was an Indian chief. So though the team realistically embraces the Indian heritage, it wasn't really named initially after, or Native American heritage. Back then it was referred to as the Indian heritage. It was not actually named after the Native American heritage originally, but because of the symbol that they used, it got that moniker. And so they continued to use a very similar symbol. They changed it a little bit, and they did a couple things with it here and there, but essentially they embraced a logo of a Native American, back then Indian chief. So the Braves name sticks. And back then it may sound weird, but a lot of teams did change their names a lot of times. It wasn't look like something as how dare you. It was done all the time. Now today it would be unthought of because we've had the same team name for over 100 years. You'd be like, what are you, nuts? You can't do that. But it was very common back then because they were just starting to build the heritage of Major League Baseball. So it was nothing for the Cleveland organization, changed their names many times. They were once called the Naps after Napoleon, their great star who played for Cleveland for years. They shortened Napoleon to Naps. They used that moniker for a long time. So here we go. The Boston Braves come right after the Rustlers. So we are the Doves from 07 to 1910. And 1911, the Rustlers. They throw Rustlers away, never to be used again. And the Boston Braves from 1912 to 1935. Wait, what? What do you mean? I thought we've been the Braves. No. We mentioned this a little earlier, but in 1936, they go to the Bees. And the Boston Bees never really caught on. Fans didn't like it. And so they went back to the Boston Braves by 1941 and stayed the Boston Braves until 1952. Now, the big thing that happens while they are the Boston Braves, in 1914, the Braves put together one of the most memorable seasons in the history of baseball. Now, listen to this. They started the season off 4-18. This is like 2023 Oakland A's bad. On July 4th, the Braves seem to be on pace for the last place finish. They've played a little better baseball, but they're still way back in the pack. On July 4th, 1914, the Braves lost both games of a doubleheader to the Brooklyn Dodgers. It put their record at 26-40. And the Braves not only were in last place, they were 15 games behind the league-leading New York Giants, who had just won the 3 previous pennants. So they weren't about to just chase down any old team. This was the team with a pedigree. After a day off, so they're off July 5th, 1914. July 6th through September 5th, about a 2-month span, the Braves, who were 26-40, started off 4-18. They go 41-12 out of nowhere. You couldn't cool them off. On September 7th and 8th, the Braves took 2 of 3 games from those Giants. They went into the series a game out. They took 2 of 3. And they are in first place. And through September and early October, they close with 25 wins and 6 losses. While the Giants, they were 16-16. But they absolutely, and you can't even call that one a collapse. When you look at the fact they're 25-6 down the stretch, you add that to the 41-12. 66-18, one of the greatest stretches in the history of Major League Baseball, arguably the greatest stretch. And when you consider the beginning to the season, it is the most miraculous stretch, hence the nickname, the Miracle Braves. Despite all that, having that kind of a 66-18 record, the Boston Braves enter the World Series as a heavy underdog to Connie Mack and his Philadelphia A's, which was known as one of the best teams in baseball at the time. The Philadelphia A's, they were elite. They were absolutely elite. And they had won championships. We go into the series, and everyone's like, man, this Philadelphia A's team is going to smoke them. Connie Mack and his Philadelphia A's, forget about it. It's over. Instead, the Braves go in and sweep the Athletics. The first sweep in the history of the World Series. There'd been one other in 1907 by the Cubs, but one game had ended in a tie because of darkness. So it was the first unqualified sweep, meaning they won every game and there was no tie. There was no replay, nothing. First sweep in the history of Major League Baseball. The 1914 Miracle Braves. And they had to play their games at Fenway Park because the South End grounds were just too small at that point. And that's the stadium that you see there. They're building the Boston Braves new stadium, and it's going to have grandstands. It's going to have structures. It's going to have seats in the outfield, the whole 9 yards. It opens in 1915, and at the time, it was the largest in the majors at the time. They were selling it out, 40,000 seats. When you think about that, 40,000 seats, that's incredible for back then. And they don't have the technology that we do today as far as, guarantee you, if you sat in that stadium in the nosebleed, you had a hard time seeing the game, but you went and you paid your money because you enjoyed the whole thing. It's not like it is today where, if you go to these newer parks, Truist Park obviously is the one I have in mind. There's really not a bad seat in the stadium. No matter how far back you are, they've pivoted you to where you can see. And if you can't see it up close, there's monitors everywhere. So the Braves win the World Series in 1914. And they would only post 2 winning records from 1917 to 1932. And so they did some things to try to bring people back into the stands. They tried to bring Christy Mathewson way past his prime into the stands. To put people in the stands brought Christy Mathewson back in the game in 1923. He was way past his prime. Now, Christy Mathewson, who's one of the greatest pitchers in the history of baseball, he had some complications from World War I that we've talked about in the past, and he actually passes away 2 years later. But in 1933 and 1934, they were pretty decent squad, competitive teams, but the revenue was still down because of the Great Depression going on. And that's when they bring in Babe Ruth to try to bring in sales. Babe Ruth gets ticked off because he believes he's going to be made manager, though the Braves say they never made that promise. That was his understanding. And Ruth was well past his prime at that point, which is where you normally see all the video, because video is really grainy and non-existent in Babe Ruth's prime. as the video got better, and that's why I always have to laugh at these chuckleheads on social media who will go to make fun of Babe Ruth and say, this guy couldn't do this. You're not looking at Babe Ruth in his prime. You're looking at Babe Ruth at the tail end of his career. And you're darn sure not seeing him in HD. Even if you find video at the beginning of his career, it's not in HD, my friend. So the Braves end up winning just the one World Series in Boston. They will stay there until 1953. They will have some pretty lean years. And that's one of the reasons why they went to the Bees and tried all these kinds of things. Went to the Boston Bees. And they had, at one point, the Atlanta Braves went 38-115. The worst season in franchise history. In 1935. So in 36, they call them the Bees. They're trying to change things around. That doesn't work. They go back to the Braves. Then here comes Warren Spahn, Johnny Sane, and the team's really starting to take off and play better baseball in the late 1940s. But they had really lost a lot of money, and they decided to move to Milwaukee by 1953. That core, though, Warren Spahn, Johnny Sane, started in Boston, ends up in Milwaukee, beating the New York Yankees for the only World Series in Milwaukee in 57. But that's the old saying that you've probably heard me quote before: Spawn and Sane and pray for rain. They had two really good pitchers, outstanding pitchers. They won the pennant in 48. They didn't win a World Series again until they ended up in Milwaukee. But they won the pennant in 48. And the pennants that they won, it was 1914 win the World Series, 1948 they lose the World Series, and then that's it. So it was some lean years in Boston. The Red Sox became much more popular. There were a lot of reasons for that. So they decided to move. At the time, it was considered out west. Teams were moving out west. Who was going to Milwaukee. And they would stay there from '53. So 1952 was our final year in Boston. They moved there from 53 to 65. And as most of y'all probably know, they then moved to the Atlanta, Georgia area, and where they've been ever since. But these are still, whether they were in Boston and being called the Beaneaters or the Stockings or the Red Caps or the Doves, or bless their hearts, the Rustlers and the Bees, that were all five of those teams were terrible. Regardless, these teams are still your Atlanta Braves. And how amazing is that? The team that I was just talking about a second ago that won all those games in the mid-30s and didn't win the pennant. And you talk about getting hosed. Because you didn't have wild cards back then. So the only team, by the way, that Braves team, 38-115, the only team that has a worse winning percentage in the modern era of baseball which was a .248 winning percentage. The only one that was worse was the 1899 Cleveland Spiders that eventually become the Guardians, the Naps, the Indians, that Cleveland team. They had a 130 winning percentage. Good Lord. 1899 was not, man, I'll tell you what, if you ever meet someone from 1899 that's still a Cleveland fan, man, you got to shake that man's hand. That's a fan. That is a fan. So that is your Boston Braves. We'll do more on the Boston Braves and the history of the Atlanta Braves, but I did want to touch on it today. Kind of get to know your history of your team. They didn't just, for some of y'all, they didn't just show up 4 or 5 years ago and you're like, hey man, this team's pretty good. I'm gonna pick them. This team has been around long time. This team, you think about this. The Braves organization started play 6 years after the Civil War ended. 6 years. That means if it wasn't for Booth and his dirty doings, Abraham Lincoln could have been sitting in the freaking stands of a Boston Redstockings game in 1871. What? Think about that. That's how long we've been around. All right, have a good one, y'all. And as always, go Braves and go baseball. This has been the Once Upon a Pastime series.
Goodbye, sweetheart. Well, it's time to go. We're back tomorrow with another show. Well, unless we're fired, we'll talk to you then. Goodbye, sweetheart. Goodbye. Goodbye.
Guys and gals, it's time to go. We'll see you on the next show.
Same bat time, same bat channel.
Thanks for listening to Braves Country with Mac McGee and the Armchair Quarterbacks on 99.1 FM WQEE, The Key in Noonan, Georgia, and simulcasting on youtube.com/@Braves Country. Braves Country comes your way weekdays, 3 p.m. Eastern to 5 p.m. Eastern. Please follow, like, and subscribe today. Armchair Quarterback Radio, your first choice for Southern sports.
Something of the 5th of September. Something of the 5th of September. She said a lot that I can't remember. Something of the 5th. Can I get another cigarette, please? Can I get another cigarette, please? Yeah, I know I live to regret it. Just give me another cigarette, please. Ha, ha! Can I get another cigarette, please?
You're listening to WQEE 99.1 FM, The Key in Noonan, Georgia.